Yes dudes, we are back again for the Promised Neverland. My name is DVGeek and today we're going to be talking about episode 4 of this great shonen anime. Now I know a lot of you guys are wondering, DVGeek, where is the reaction? I want to see the reaction first. Of course, like always, link in the description dudes, multiple links in fact to suit your device on watching the video and my first impressions and reaction to this episode of The Promised Neverland. Now, make sure you get back here to see my review of this episode and of course, leave me a like before you check out the reaction. Now, let's talk about this episode. Holy crap! I mean, there's a lot going on here. Now, this basic premise of this episode was to find out who is the traitor, who is among the children that is working directly for Mom. So it's interesting to see how this plays out. So watching this episode, of course, they're trying to find out who it is, trying to analyze who the suspects are, narrow it down to a possible few, and that's exactly what they did. The mastermind in this episode, in my opinion, was Norman. I think that goes out for a lot of you guys out there that has watched the episode, that Norman is actually the one that's coming up with all the plan, putting everything together, being the one that's being more super analytical when it comes to everybody in this, because you have to make sure to know that everybody is a suspect and you can't trust anyone, and that's even including the likes of Emma, Norman himself, and of course Ray. So it could be anybody in this that is potentially the informant that is working directly for Isabel, aka Mom. Now in this episode they've really focused on that, trying to scope out who it potentially is. Now Norman, being the mastermind, came up with the idea of telling both Dawn and Gilda about what's happened, you know, what they have discovered, and just sharing that important piece of information to them, because for one, they need to find out who the informant is, and them two were kind of particularly highlighting this, that they may potentially be the informant. And two, well, they need all the help they can get, and they need other people to have the same understanding and the same information that they have themselves originally, to make things a little bit easier and go a little bit smoother, and of course giving them the motive to escape also. So that's very, very important. Now Norman, being the mastermind, came up with this whole idea of telling them that. Now he also came up with a plan that Ray seemed to be very curious about. Now Ray in this episode was asking a lot of questions, was very interested in what plans Norman was coming up to, and if you watch it for the second time like I did, you notice that Ray is very curious about Norman's plan, and Norman is willingly telling this to Ray for reasons that we find out later on in this episode. Now, to find out who the actual informant is, Norman put together a plan where he said that he told both Isabel and Dawn where the rope is, now giving them two different locations, and if the rope disappears from the locations that he said, then whichever location that is, it highlights who actually is the traitor. Now of course, Ray being the one asking all the questions, he also found it quite interesting why Norman didn't tell the whole truth about Connie, and why they didn't tell that Connie and the rest are most likely dead. Now they didn't want to do that because they didn't want both Dawn and Gilda to lose focus, to lose hope, because hearing something like that can have two possible effects. One, increase their motive, which of course is work as an advantage for them in the escape, or two, completely break down, freak out, and just lose all hope of having them to help them in this escape plan, which is probably why Norman didn't want to take that risk in the first place. And of course Ray was wondering why that is, and Norman told Ray, look, I've got all the plan put together, I'm going to find out who the traitor is, and he shared all of this information with Ray. Now if you focus really heavily on this episode, you notice that both Norman and Ray are in this episode, and they're together quite a lot throughout this episode, and you can tell that Norman is, I don't know, somewhat intentionally with Ray a lot of the time, kind of filling him in on information that Ray seems to be very, very heavily curious about, which I found quite interesting as well. And of course, you know, Emma being so close to everybody in this, she was kind of left in that position where she just didn't want to believe that anybody, no matter who it is, could be the traitor. But of course, Ray, being the realist that he is, has to make sure that she needs to understand that it could be anyone. You can't trust anyone. Everybody is a suspect. And then, like I said, it was narrowed down to Gilda and Dawn. Gilda being you know, watched by Emma, of course, very closely, and Gilda suspiciously left the room at night, which obviously, you know, it lit up some red lights for me. It lit up red lights for Emma, so she had to follow her and see where she's gone. But it seems Sister Crone was trying to implement a mole of her own, and that was actually Gilda, trying to get Gilda to spill out information that she may have found out and all that. But Gilda didn't break, and that's what made me realize, yep, it's not Gilda. It couldn't be Gilda, because Gilda didn't break to Sister Crone. No matter what Sister Crone said, even though Sister Crone was trying to let out that she knew what the plan was, that she knew that Emma and Ray and Norman told Gilda something, but Gilda didn't break, so I'm proud of her. I'm super proud of her. She kept to her word. She stayed loyal to the very end, and of course that was very difficult for her as a character. You know, she broke down in tears when she saw Emma, because obviously she was scared. She was terrified, but she stood her ground. So that kind of guarantees it now that Gilda is not in fact the informant. She is safe, and she is out of the equation when it comes to suspects. Now, we still have a potential suspect, or should I say potential suspects, in this episode, because we don't know if Dawn is in fact the traitor. Now, we did see that somebody slipped a note under Isabel's door telling Isabel where the rope is, and the note said that the rope is under the bed, and that location was given to Dawn. So is Dawn the traitor? And of course, that is when we get to the end scene where both Norman and Ray try to find the rope and see if it has been removed from the areas that he said. They firstly checked the ceiling of the bathroom. The rope was there, which was fine, which means Gilda is safe. And then they checked the bed to see that the rope has actually disappeared. So does that make Dawn the traitor? Asks Ray. And it seemed Norman was going to say, yeah, it must be Dawn. It has to be Dawn. Dawn must be the traitor because I told him about this. But then he just turns to Ray and say, so it's you. You're the traitor. And that was like, whoa. Whoa. And I said this at the end of my reaction, that I had this inkling in my mind that it may potentially be Ray who is the traitor, because if you watch him in this episode, you can see he's so interested in Norman's plan. He's constantly asking questions about Norman's plan. Like, he wants to know. And he is the one person that knows everything about the plan. Telling Ray this is very interesting, because it will highlight the fact that he may potentially be the one that is the traitor amongst them, which is kind of a big of a curveball for all of us viewers, considering that Ray, Emma, and Norman are highlighted as the three main protagonists of the show. Now, don't get me wrong, this might not be a bad thing altogether. Maybe Ray was the realist. He's the one that knows how to survive, and he thought maybe if I just go ahead and work directly with Isabel, Mom, and tell her everything that she needs to know, then she'll spare my life, because it was him that brought that idea into fruition in this episode. He did say, oh, maybe the person that is the traitor is only doing this for their own survival, to guarantee their survival. That it was Ray that brought that into light, you know. And I think Norman found that quite interesting, that Ray was the one that brought that into light. And then Norman actually asked Emma, if you found out who the traitor was and they were doing it just merely to survive, would you still ask them to come with us if we're trying to escape? And Emma, being the kind-hearted soul that she is, said, yes, I would. And Norman responded, but what if the person didn't want to go? And Emma said, I'd force him to go, because if we actually get our way to escape, then that person will end up inevitably dying. So I thought that was interesting. I think Norman was already suspicious of Ray when he asked Emma this question, because he wanted to know, what would Emma do if we found out that Ray was potentially the traitor? Will we still bring him along? And it looks like, yes, that may potentially be the case. And if Ray is actually the traitor, now it's not guaranteed, it's not set in stone that Ray is a traitor. It was just a question that Norman asked Ray. And of course, Ray took it to shock. He's like, what? There's no way. But if he is the traitor, then this could be worked to an advantage. If Norman has finally found out the traitor is, and he can actually get Ray to confess that he is in fact the traitor, he is the informant for Isabel, then they can use that to their advantage by feeding Isabel false information, leading her astray from the original plan in order to successfully escape this orphanage. So I think that's really awesome, and I think that's really interesting to think about, and I think it may potentially be the case that, of course, is all speculation. That, of course, is just prediction, so it's not set in stone. But all in all, I really enjoyed this episode, dudes. I thought it was quite interesting. I love the character of Norman. From watching this episode, I feel like Norman is the brightest of the three. I think he is the mastermind. He's the one kind of putting the plan together. He's the one that's finding out who the traitor is. He's coming up with all the great ideas, and I think if Norman wasn't here, they'd be all screwed, because Emma is too caring. She's a bit naive. She doesn't think about these things. And Ray, he's kind of selfish in ways. He's a realist. He'll find the best and quickest possible solutions to survive. And of course, you just needed that one person to find out what plan to put together, find out who or who isn't a part of the team, or who is willing to work with them, and really put these things into perspective, you know. So right now, I think Norman is my favorite character in this show, and I honestly cannot wait for the next episode to see what Ray's response is to this confrontation by Norman. Absolutely amazing episode, and honestly cannot wait for freaking more. It's gonna be awesome. Winter Anime 2019 is fantastic, dudes, and I love it. I love it to death. But anyway, that does end my review of this episode, guys. If you did enjoy, make sure you leave a like here. I greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you want to see more The Promised Neverland content from me in the future, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Let's get this channel to 100k. Eventually we'll get there, and I hope it's this year. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, dudes, and as always, stay geeky, stay cool, be awesome, and be happy. I'll see you, dudes, in my next Promised Neverland video. See you later, dudes!